All right, we are back with White Stallions of Lipizza, Chapter 23, A Rascal in the Gallery. What's a rascal?
A rascal is a brat.
A brat. Somebody who's up to no good. The following Saturday, like a flash of lightning, Colonel Pudchowski announced the news, looking directly at Hans. One of our riding masters is taken seriously ill. Berreeder Wittick will ride his stallion in Sunday's performance, and we'll need you, Hans, to ride Borina. Me? Hans asked with a quick catch of his breath. He looked into the dark eyes questioningly. Why, this was like skipping a year in school, almost like graduation. The eyes smiled back. You will take part in the last event only, the quadrille. Now then, at 10 o'clock this morning, we rehearse to music. There will be the usual tourists and visitors in the galleries, so it will be like a regular performance. Be saddled and ready for your entrance at 11. Hans was terrified and thrilled all at the same time. He had never worked before an audience. The galleries had always been empty. Besides, the quadrille was the grand climax of the entire ballet. Next to the aerial leaps, he thought it the most beautiful of all. For a year now, he and the other young writers had been practicing the precise figures, the turns and movements on 2 tracks, the flying change of leg on the canter, half pirouettes, full pirouettes, the passage, and, last of all, the piaffe. He knew them. He was ready. He put on the cinnamon brown frock coat and the bicorn hat belonging to some previous writer. You'll have your own some day, the tailor told him. That is, he added, clapping Hans on the back, if you have better luck than the last fellow who wore this. 11 o'clock came in the anteroom of the hall. Then the 8 riders sat mounted on their snow-white stallions and silently lined up. Then, to the airy music of the polonaise, they entered the great hall as at a performance. Colonel Pudchowski led the procession, followed by Berreeder Wittick, then Hans on Borina, then Herr Braun. Hans felt tremulous, yet somehow secure between these 2 men who wanted him to succeed. Borina was serenity itself, his ears busy with the music, pulling in the familiar melody. So here he is, leading his horse and getting ready at the tailor. The music heightened the pleasure for Hans, too, as they paraded in stately fashion between the red, white, and red flags that crowned the training pillars. Keeping his body erect, his shoulders parallel to Borina's, he felt in perfect harmony, felt himself ready for tomorrow's performance, ready for anything. Even in the entrance walk, the joy of rhythm, the pride in Borina filled him with such a fullness that he wondered if the buttons of his uniform might spew into the air. Of all the stallions, Borina seemed the most buoyant, the most obedient. Up in the galleries, the morning visitors were on hand. Hans had been carefully schooled to be oblivious to them. He tried to remember this as he sensed a movement in the first gallery. He was turning in a platoon of 4 when his attention was caught by a blue beret waving wildly. Out of the tail of his eye, he saw the figure of Jacques leaning far out over the railing, and sitting behind him, the boy's father, grinning. In that hairbreadth of divided attention, Hans unconsciously tightened his reins, and instantly Borina sank back on his haunches, raised up his body in the beginning of a courbet, and dumped Hans onto the floor like a sack of potatoes. There was a soft thump as he hit. The music did not stop, nor did the complex pattern of the dance. Only Hans's heart stopped. Then it bumped against his chest. He could feel the colonel's glance like an icy finger. Overcome with misery, Hans scrambled to his feet and caught up to Borina, who was setting one leg carefully across the other in cadence movement with the other horses. Remounting, he closed the space which Herr Braun had kept open. Over and above the violins, he could hear guffaws and giggles from the galleries and the sound of a slapped thigh. Later, back in the stables, Hans worked in a trance. He took off the handsome coat that didn't belong to him anyway. He rubbed Borina dry under his saddle, along his chest, down his legs. The stallion submitted with pleasure, scratching his head against Hans's shoulder to relieve the itchy places where the bridle leathers had been. He still felt playful, and he nipped a piece of Hans's shirt without touching the flesh beneath. In spite of his torn heart, Hans neglected none of the routine. He took more pains, if anything, as if this were their last time together. I don't blame you, he said, feeling the stallion's breath brushing against his cheek. But what will I do now? How else can I live? He asked, beseeching. The limpid eyes held no answer, only the boy's reflection in their purple-brown depths. His grooming done, Hans closed the stall door behind him, and he walked past the stable-master, moved down the corridor, and up the worn stone steps to his room. It was empty. Carefully, he hung his borrowed uniform in the wardrobe. He brushed the sawdust from the beautiful wine-brown serge, and he buttoned up the silver buttons. Even third-hand, the uniform would still be almost as good as new. He put on an old shirt and a pair of work trousers, and pulled out his father's old brown satchel from under the bed. He packed in it the few clothes he had brought with him. They were too small now, but they would fit Jacques. And as he snapped the lock, he heard a violent cough behind him and turned to see Kurt. With red-faced kindness, the boy said, "Colonel Podchasky is talking below with Bereder Wittig. They want to see you." Uh-oh. What do you think they want to tell him? Here he is falling off his horse. Think it's going to be good news?
Yes.
I don't know. I know. Hans picked up his satchel. For a long while he stood in the doorway, glancing around the room in goodbye. He shook hands with Kurt, and then he squared his shoulders and went down the stairs. The stable seemed deathly quiet. Herr Stallmeister, his assistant, the feedmaster, grooms, and stable boys all were going about their duties, silent and remote, like figures in a dream. Staring straight ahead, Hans took one heavy step forward, then another. He heard Colonel Podchasky and Bereder Wittig in low-voiced conference near Barina's stall. He moved toward them, toward what was going to happen to him. When he was within earshot, the talk ceased. Time stood still. The colonel's face was immobile. His hands were intertwined, and Hans noticed their size and strength. They were clearly made to arouse a horse, to calm a horse, to lead a horse. The man's eyes were fixed on the boy standing there, setting down the brown satchel as if it were full of stone. "Hans hopped. Whose fault was it?" The voice was an arrow. Hans choked out the word. "Mine." Again that probing gaze, that arrow-like voice. "You do not blame Barina?" "Oh, no, sir. He was teaching me." "No, sir. He's no and what about that rascal in the gallery? Was he to blame?" "No, sir. He's no rascal. He's my nephew." The colonel paused. The merest wisp of a smile crossed his face. His attention seemed to wander down the aisle of stalls with the white faces and white ears listening. At last he said, "You have given the answer of a true horseman, Hans." He turned to Bereder Wittig. "No art ever remains at the same level. Rise and fall follow each other in eternal alteration. Eh, Wittig?" The riding master nodded, and his eyes were the mildest blue. Hans felt a flood tide of relief. He wanted to cry and to laugh, and he wanted to do push-ups and handsprings. But before he could think what to say, Colonel Podchasky laid a hand on his shoulder. "Here is one apprentice," he said, speaking to Bereder Wittig, "whose eye will never stray again, no matter if 40 elephants wave their trunks over the gallery." With that, he made a grenadier turn and was gone. Later that day, a stable boy brought Hans a letter written on a square of lined school paper in neatest penmanship, and the message read, "Dear Uncle Hans, I'm sorry I made you fall off. I did not laugh. Your nephew, Jacques. P.S. Rosie died today also. Montpierre will now buy automobile." Hans read the letter twice. Then he refolded it and tucked it away in his father's old satchel in the pocket, very gently, as if it were a circlet of hairs from Rosie's tail. It was like putting away the young years of his life.